So I wanted to spend some time talking about the materials that are attached to this course, specifically the lab guide. Throughout this course, each lecture in this course, with the exception of the introduction, has a lab associated with it. And all the labs, and I believe there's about 13 or 14 in total, are part of a single lab guide. So the lab guide should be attached to the introductory course. Since I couldn't find a way to attach it to the course in general, it's tied to the introductory lesson. So here's the cover page for the lab guide, nothing fancy here. And it's in PDF, so please download this prior to completing any of the labs. And the lab videos that I record pretty much follow the lab guide that you see here. So I don't try to deviate a whole lot from the lab guide, but I do provide a lot more background in the video that accompanies the lab guide. So if you're just looking to execute the labs, just using the lab guide and not following along in the videos, you can certainly do that, but you'll learn a lot more, I think, if you do watch the videos. Anyway, you can see here we have 13 different labs, from installing WebLogic all the way down to WebLogic scripting tool. So just to provide a quick overview so you can get an idea as to how this lab guide is put together. Each lab is organized into 4 different sections. There's a skills learned section which highlights what you're going to learn in that lab. And the overview provides kind of a detailed background for the lab, what you're actually going to do. And then the configuration parameters usually is a set of tables that define configuration parameters for, say, creating a WebLogic server or a JDBC resource or a JMS server. Rather than embed those configuration items or details in the lab text itself, I kind of break that out into a separate table, and you'll see that referenced throughout the lab. So, conventions. This is really why I put this little lecture together on the lab guide. For the purposes of this lab, we're going to refer to Unix-style file paths or file names or environment settings. If there's a significant deviation with respect to Windows, then I will call that out in this lab guide. For the most part, when you install WebLogic in Windows, all the shell versions, versions of WebLogic scripts do exist in Windows versions. So instead of being .sh files, they'll be .cmd or .bat files. So the syntax will be the same. The parameters will be the same. The scripts will be the same for the most part. However, just the Windows file naming conventions and directory conventions will be different, obviously. So just to keep the lab guide simple and uncluttered, we stuck with Unix style. And another area that I want to focus on are these lab directories. So to ensure some consistency and to reduce the amount of variability for all of you out there and for me, I came up with a standardized directory structure that I refer to throughout the lab. And it starts with lab home. So everything in this lab hangs off of this lab home directory reference. Some of you may be looking at these and thinking, oh, these are environment variables. They are not. You can certainly create them if you'd like, save you some time from typing them on the command line, but these are not environment variables that you have to create. These are just references, shortcuts that I use throughout the lab guide. And so, like I said, everything hangs off of lab home. And in Unix, on my system, I created it off of U01 Udemy. And so everything from WebLogic install to domains to applications gets put underneath lab home. So it doesn't matter what your lab home is. You can set it up to be whatever you want. However, everything underneath lab home should be relatively consistent. And so what I mean by that, Oracle root, Oracle home, domain root, domain home, application, and Derby home, all these references here hang off of lab home. You can define lab home to be whatever you want to be, but try to be consistent with the rest of the directory references, because I do use these throughout the rest of the lab guide. So you won't see a fully qualified path when we're either executing a command or trying to locate a file in the lab guide. We'll use the shortcut. However, when you're executing commands, especially with WebLogic, always use a fully qualified path. Don't use relative paths. Okay, hardware requirements. I may have covered this in the introductory course, and if I didn't, we're going to be starting up, worst case scenario, we're going to be starting up 2 or 3, maybe even 4 WebLogic servers. And so I would recommend You could get away with half a gig of RAM per WebLogic server. A gig of RAM, no more than a gig of RAM per server. So I'd say for this lab, you need between 4 and 6 gigs of RAM. And for disk space, I'd say 3 gigabytes, maybe 4 gigabytes is safe, 2 gigabytes at a minimum. And for software required, well, so the lab guide has instructions on downloading the 12C generic installer, which can be used on any platform. It uses Java to install the product. And then JDK 1.7, there's a link in the references section, which I'll talk about in a second, to download and install that. So this lab guide does not include instructions on installing Java. And by the way, we can't use OpenJDK. We want to use the Oracle JDK. So if you've got a Linux environment, specifically if it's like Ubuntu or CentOS or whatever your favorite distribution is, most likely it's OpenJDK, and that's due to licensing issues with Oracle JDK. So Oracle JDK is free and it's open source. You can go download it from oracle.com, and there's a link in the guide, in this guide, to do that. But OpenJDK is not supported. And the last bit of software you need, and this should be obvious, but you need a text editor. You're going to need one. If you're in, it doesn't matter what type of text editor or which text editor, you just need to have access to one. In the lab guide, I make heavy use of VI because I'm usually SSH'd into a server, so it's easier and quicker for me just to use VI in some cases. But any editor will work. Okay, and if you need help, either respond to me via this course or go to my website, learnweblogiconline.com, and send me a message, please. I'd be more than happy to assist you or answer any questions that you have that weren't answered in the lab or in any of the lectures. Okay, so here's an example. I'm not going to go through each and every lab guide, but this is how it's laid out. So lab number 1 covers installing WebLogic. And you can see here we've got the duration and the skills that you're going to learn, hopefully, and an overview of the lab, which sometimes regurgitates what skills are being learned. And then under configuration parameters, you can see here that we've got those tables I was talking about that define for performing configuration within the lab. So you can see here we have the lab home directory. We've got generic installers. So when we run the generic installer, it's going to ask us for these values, and I'm specifying these here. So you can see, for instance, under table 3, for the inventory directory parameter, I have lab home/aura inventory. When you're installing WebLogic, do not enter the literal value lab_home. Please be sure to substitute the real fully qualified path for lab home. Okay, so, and then it proceeds with the instructions, which is simply a table broken out by sections. So in this case, section 1 is preparing your environment. Section 2 is installing JDK 7, and there's a link to do that. And then the third section is installing WebLogic 12C using the generic installer. So these are how the labs are laid out. Now I want to jump down, and this is a pretty long document. There's about 70 plus pages here. And so each one of these lab guides is associated with a lecture. So the very last page is a references section. And in the references section, I've provided some very handy and required links for this lab guide. And so if you're going to download Oracle WebLogic, you need to create an Oracle account, and it's free. So you can go to this website here and go ahead and create an Oracle account. And same with JDK 7 as well. So here's the links to download JDK 7, and then the install guide for JDK 7, and there's one per platform type. And then the 12C downloads page, and then the online documentation, which is an excellent resource. So here, it's bookmarked here. I've also got the Derby admin guide listed here. If you want to know more about Derby, Derby is the database that comes in with WebLogic. It's merely for development or just really for sandbox. I would not use it in a production environment. You've got an enterprise class application server. You're going to want to use an enterprise class database on the back end. So don't use Derby database. But it is a database, and we do use it in this lab guide when we configure a data source. And then there's additional reference links for the MBean reference and WLST and the proxy. So we'll dive into more detail on these topics later on. And so that's pretty much it for the lab guide. I hope that kind of gives you an idea as to how this lab guide is organized and what to expect. So let's start with the next lecture, our first lecture on WebLogic, installing WebLogic.